My grandfather flew 6 hours just to be at my brother's wedding. He showed up in an old suit, shoulders bent but eyes still sharp, holding on to a hope that he could belong. My parents didn't even let him near the ceremony. They sat him behind the trash cans, the smoke from the grill choking him, while strangers in designer clothes pretended not to see. When I asked my mother why she hissed, "That old beggar will embarrass us." And when I tried to defend him, she slapped me in front of everyone and had me thrown out. 20 minutes later, the ground trembled with the roar of engines, and his private jet descended from the autumn sky. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story can reach. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. If my story touches you, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It means more than you know. I'm Arlo Finch, and this is the truth I never thought I'd have to tell. The moment I stepped onto the orchard grounds, I felt like an intruder in my own family's story. The place smelled of wood smoke and cinnamon apple pies cooling somewhere behind the old brick oven while lanterns swayed against the beams of the weathered horse barn. The late autumn light cut the orchard rows into stripes of gold and shadow, and guests in sleek suits and jewel-colored gowns drifted between the trees like they owned the land. I tugged at the sleeves of the borrowed suit I wore, already aware I didn't belong. When my mother Vivian spotted me across the lawn, her eyes went sharp and cold. She didn't return my greeting, just raised her glass to someone more worthy of her time. A man beside her leaned close and whispered just loud enough, "So that's the older one. He looks different." My father Malcolm stood nearby, but when I stepped toward him, he simply averted his gaze, as if the sight of me demanded too much courage. Gideon, my younger brother, the groom, glided from guest to guest, hand in hand with Clara, all smiles, though when he passed near me his eyes slid away, pretending I wasn't even there. It was then that I saw my grandfather. They had sat him not near the ceremony, not among family, but on a folding chair jammed between the trash cans and the smoking grill. His old suit sagged, his shoulders bent, but his eyes still gleamed beneath bushy brows. He coughed softly, pulling a handkerchief to his mouth, and when he noticed me staring, he managed a brittle smile as if to reassure me. My chest burned. I marched to my mother. "Why is he sitting there?" Vivian's lips barely moved, her voice a venomous whisper. "That old man will embarrass us. Don't you dare start trouble. I won't let him be treated like garbage." I shot back loud enough for two guests to pause mid-conversation. Her hand cracked across my face before I could finish. Gasps rose. Someone lifted a phone recording. My father took a half-step forward as if to intervene, but then turned his back like always. Gideon appeared at my side, his jaw tight. "Don't ruin my wedding, Arlo," he said, and then he was gone again, leaving me in the stairs. My grandfather's hand trembled as he clasped mine. In his palm lay a silver ring etched with a single F, Florence, my grandmother's name. His voice was hoarse. "Keep this. One day you'll understand." He closed my fingers over it with surprising strength. Within minutes I was escorted off the lawn by hired security. Tessa, the longtime employee who had served this family longer than I'd been alive, watched me with pity but said nothing. I ended up beneath the ancient apple tree, where at 10 years old I had carved my name into its bark. I traced the faded grooves with my thumb, feeling smaller than ever, banished from blood. The laughter from the party drifted across the orchard, but I no longer heard it. What I heard instead was the growl of engines. At first a distant hum, then louder, heavier, until the earth itself trembled under my shoes. I lifted my head to the autumn sky. Something was coming, and it wasn't part of the wedding. The roar didn't fade, it swelled. I followed the sound up the slope, heart pounding, and there it was, a private jet slicing through the cloudless sky, banking low. The plane descended onto what I had always thought was family folklore, an old airstrip hidden beyond the orchard hill once used to ship apples decades ago. I had believed my grandfather's stories were just tall tales told by a man growing old. Yet here it was real and alive. As the jet taxied, a convoy appeared, a black Bentley followed by two gleaming SUVs. Doors opened and out stepped my grandfather. Not the hunched figure in a worn suit who had coughed into a handkerchief an hour earlier, but a man upright and sharp-tailored suit pressed sunglasses reflecting the orchard's golden light. 3 bodyguards flanked him. He removed his glasses and fixed me with eyes burning like flint. "Are you ready to set things right?" I could hardly breathe. The frailty, the poverty, it had all been a mask. He strode toward me, and with each step, the truth seemed to peel away the lies my family had draped over him. "Vivian and Gideon forged papers," he said in a low, urgent voice. "Declared me senile so they could take the company. Your father kept silent. Gideon changed the locks, shut us out of the harvest festivals. But I kept what matters." He pressed a thick envelope into my hands, the original will naming me heir to the orchard. Florence's letter in her looping handwriting and documentation of their forgeries. The wedding's music and chatter floated faintly from the other side of the hill as we walked together toward the reception. Lanterns flickered overhead as we slipped through a side gate. The master of ceremonies was just introducing the bride and groom when my grandfather mounted the platform. Without hesitation, he wrenched the microphone from Vivian's manicured hand. "I was not invited to this wedding," he declared, his voice cutting across the stunned crowd. "I was sat by the trash cans to be humiliated. But let me remind you all, this orchard was built by me from nothing for my wife Florence and for the future of this family, not for those standing here tonight pretending to inherit it." He placed his hand firmly on my shoulder, his grip anchoring me in front of the crowd. "This place was built for Arlo, not for you." The silver ring burned against my skin. I stepped forward, meeting the stares, hearing the shudders of cameras and the rising buzz of disbelief. Guests whispered, gasped, pulled out their phones. Vivian's face flushed crimson, her composure cracking. And then came the twist no one saw coming. My grandfather wasn't a frail, forgotten old man. He had walked back into this wedding with power intact, proof in hand, and an authority none of them could erase. The room seemed to tilt as silence fell, broken only by the clatter of a dropped glass. My grandfather turned back to Vivian, his voice iron. "This wedding will not proceed until the truth is spoken." The lanterns swayed, shadows trembling on the barn walls, as if the orchard itself was holding its breath. Vivian clawed the microphone back like it belonged to her veins. "He's confused," she shouted, voice splintering under the rafters. "Don't listen to a word he says." Harlan didn't flinch. He lifted a hand, and his attorney stepped forward with a folder embossed with a notary seal. The attorney read clean and steady, each sentence landing like the strike of a gavel. "The original will execute it in sound mind, leaving the orchard and its holdings to me as Florence wished." A hush pressed over the lawn. The lanterns trembled on their hooks. I felt every eye turn. My mouth was dry, but the words were there, buried under years of being told to be quiet. When I was invited to present my research at MIT, my mother tore the letter in half at the kitchen table, I said. She called it childish. She said we don't need dreamers. She said I should stop embarrassing the family. I let the silence stretch, then nodded to Harlan. A projector hummed to life, and a video window filled the barn wall. My father slipping into a law office after hours, his head down, the timestamp matching the day Harlan had been hospitalized. A second file zoomed in on the medical document bearing Harlan's name. The signature at the bottom was a sloppy twin of the doctor's, the kind of mimicry that looks fine unless you know what you're seeing. Gasps scattered like birds through the crowd. Clara's mascara had already started to run. I didn't know she cried, palms open as if she could cup the truth and keep it from spilling. Gideon clung to the only rope he had. We were protecting the brand, he said, voice wobbling. Mom was protecting our name. Around us the guests rose and drifted, some putting on coats, some raising their phones, the red dots of recording lights peppering the dusk. A pair of investors I recognized from articles slipped toward the parking lot without shaking hands. Harlan's voice cut cleanly through the murmur. No vows will be spoken on this land while the truth is buried. It was not loud, but it carried. The chorus of lanterns answered tin on tin as the wind cuffed them together. Vivian tried to smile as if the last 5 minutes had been a weather report that would soon pass. Everyone, please, she said too brightly. Let's take a moment. But her eyes darted toward Gideon, then over his shoulder toward the fermentation barn. Tessa edged close enough that her whisper was a thread only I could catch. Come tonight, she said. "There's something you have to see in the fermentation house." The words landed and my mind snapped to a laminated sheet I'd seen tacked near the steel tank's sanitation protocol. The date scrawled in black marker had bothered me because it matched the day the new batch of Florence's gold had entered active fermentation. No one deep cleans during an active ferment. Not if they care about life in the yeast. My mother's hand had signed that sheet. I remembered the ink stroke like a knife. The party began to clot and thin in uneven patches. Voices rose and fell. A server collected champagne flutes that no one wanted anymore. My father stood with his hands in his pockets, eyes fixed on the grass. He looked like a man waiting for a bus that would never come. I turned the silver ring on my finger until the engraved letter pressed a crescent into my skin. Somewhere inside the ring of guests, Gideon was on his phone again, jaw-tight eyes flicking from me to the barn and back like a metronome wound too tight. I stepped closer to the edge of the platform so I could see them both, my mother with her lacquered smile, my brother with his nerves fraying. "This is not about brand protection," I said, calm and flat. "This is about a woman who taught me to press apples with my hands and the promise I gave her when she told me this land remembers who loves it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The orchard carried it for me. When we finally left the platform, the path toward the side gate felt longer than when we had come in. Guests parted and watched us pass. Some nodded. Some looked at their shoes. Tessa fell into step, her expression set in the kind of grief you only see on people who have stayed too long in one place and loved it even longer. At the gate, she touched my arm. "They've already been in it." She said so soft the words barely made the air. "They've touched the last of hers." The night air had the edge of cider. Far off the highway thrummed. I looked back once more at the lanterns at the barn that had held every harvest celebration since I was a boy, and then out to the darkness beyond the hill where the old airstrip lay like a scar stitched into the earth. I closed my fingers around the ring until the metal bit me. The fight had only lifted its head. I could feel the rest of it breathing in the dark. "Tonight," I said to Tessa, "show me." She nodded, and for a second she wasn't an employee or a witness, but the last hinge holding two halves of a door together. We walked down into the rows. Leaves whispered. Somewhere a glass fell and shattered behind us. I didn't turn. My mind had already moved ahead to the barn, to the locked door, and the keypads Gideon controlled to the laminated protocol, with the wrong date to Florence's handwriting in the letter tucked in my jacket. In the wind, I heard her voice, the one that told stories about yeast like they were songs. By the time we reached the gravel path, my decision had already been made. I would see it with my own eyes. I would bring it into the light. Night put a metal taste on the air. The orchard groaned softly under a new wind as we crossed the yard. The farther we got from the party, the more the sounds of celebration thinned to a dull smear, like music heard through a wall. The fermentation house rose out of the dark with its corrugated roof hunched like shoulders. A sodium bulb flickered to life above the side door, washing everything in a sickly blue. Inside, the cold hit first, then the smell. Apples and alcohol and something meaner like a hospital corridor after the mop has been wrung out 3 times too many. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, failing in staccato bursts that made the shadows jump. The tanks stood like silent giants, their steel flanks beaded with a fine sweat. Somewhere in the rafters, a mouse skittered. Somewhere behind the walls, a drip counted time. Tessa didn't waste words. She led me to a battered desk, scarred with years of harvests, then tapped the keyboard on the security monitor. The screen bloomed to grainy life. She navigated with quick, practiced clicks and pulled up last night's feed from the camera perched above the primary fermenter we reserved for Florence's gold. I watched my brother enter the frame, checking over his shoulder before he climbed the ladder and swung the hatch. Steam bloomed. A minute later, my mother came in, clipboard in hand. She signed the page clipped there, and he lifted a container from the floor. When he tipped it, the liquid poured out heavy and cloudy, the kind of opacity that has nothing to do with apple or yeast. It vanished into the fermenting must like milk disappearing into coffee. "That's not cleaner," I said, though no one had asked me to name it. The word came out raw. Tessa pulled a small glass bottle from the drawer, sealed tight with tape. "I took a sample," she said. before they could finish. The bottle caught the light. Even through the glass, I could smell the burn. Every part of me wanted to look away. Instead, I stepped closer to the tank and gripped the ladder rail until my knuckles went white. I could hear Florence in the echo of the room telling me when to listen to the bubbling to know if the yeast was happy, showing me how to lay a palm on the tank wall to feel life moving under metal. Wine holds memory, she used to say, half joking, half praying. Whoever spoils it is trying to erase us. My mind started breaking it into pieces so I could stand it upright, the protocol dated wrong, the signature in my mother's hand, the container in my brother's, the way he glanced at the door before he poured. I had thought humiliation at a wedding was the bottom. This was lower, a kind of theft that takes the past itself. "What are you going to do?" Tessa asked. Answering meant picking a side I could never leave. If I took this public, it would set my family on fire, reputation business, the myth of who we were. If I kept it quiet, I'd be complicit in the killing of the very thing I'd promised to keep alive. I pressed the silver ring to the ladder rail and felt the metal grind metal. The choice hurt, which made me think it was probably the right one. "We're not keeping this," I said, "not in the dark." I stepped outside for air and crossed instinctively to the oldest tree in the yard, the one with my 10-year-old scrawl faded into its trunk. I rested my forehead against the bark until the cold steadied me. Snow flashed in my memory the night last winter when I drove through a whiteout with a thermos of ginger tea for Harlan, the tires fighting the road, the heater failing, my breath a cloud. I'd read him the sports section beside his bed, and he'd listened like a boy listening to a campfire tale, then touched my wrist and said the quietest thing I'd ever heard from him. "You're the only one who still hears the land, Arlo." Being chosen had felt like warmth then. Tonight it felt like a weight, but it was the kind you lift because you must. When we came back around the corner, a pin of blue light winked and went out. I froze. Across the yard, half hidden by the shadow of a tank, Gideon lowered his phone and slipped into the dark like a fox. He had been watching us, recording us. The scene flipped on its head in an instant. All he needed was a snippet of video and a few words to tell it his way. 2 saboteurs caught red-handed in the barn after hours. The narrative was already writ. I felt the burn of it and then let it pass. Panic would serve him. Clarity would serve me. "We report it tomorrow," I said. "All of it. In front of people who can't look away." Tessa nodded. She tucked the sample bottle and a copy of the footage into a second envelope and wrote the time across the seal. We turned off the lights, locked the door, and stood a moment listening to the orchard settle. In the distance came the faintest trace of laughter from the last stubborn pockets of partygoers, brittle and thin as glass. On the walk back, I rehearsed the morning in my head. The council would convene in the great room, heavy table, apple carvings on the walls, the clock that had ticked through every harvest since before I was born. I would place the bottle on the wood. I would play the video. I would lay down the will in Florence's letter and say her name out loud. I would give them the choice that had closed around me, protect the lie or save what deserved to live. The ring warmed against my skin as if it remembered her hand. By the time I reached the edge of the lawn, the plan had clicked into place with a finality that felt like a door closing behind me. I looked once toward the hill where the runway slept in the dark, then at the barn where the lanterns were nearly out. The orchard exhaled. The wind took the last thin ribbon of music. Somewhere a fox barked and was gone. I didn't pray exactly. I just told the truth to the night and promised I would tell it again at first light. Morning laid a thin veil of fog across the fields, and the council room in the main house felt like a throat clearing itself. Carved apple vines curled along the paneled walls. The pendulum clock clicked and clicked, measuring out a patience I no longer had. Through the window, the orchard rose faded into white breath. On the long table in front of me sat everything I had carried through the night, the bottle of Florence's gold that now stung like bleach through the cork, the USB drive with the security footage, the envelope holding the will and my grandmother's letter, its paper soft from decades of hands. Vivian stared at me with the practiced pity she used on people she wanted to be smaller. Gideon tipped back in his chair and let it thud forward again, a boy playing at being powerful. Malcolm tucked himself into the corner as if a shadow might volunteer to speak for him. Harlan sat to my right, his fingers drumming a quiet code into the table, then stilled. He nodded once a signal take it. I lifted the bottle so the room could smell what I smelled and set it down with a dull knock. This was supposed to be Florence's gold. Now it contains industrial solvent. The glass captured a shard of pale light. I plugged in the USB drive and the monitor on the credenza flickered. The video rolled. Gideon climbed the ladder, looked over his shoulder, opened the hatch. Vivian stepped in and signed a laminated sheet on her clipboard. The cloudy liquid poured. No one spoke while the image played, as if silence might scrub the screen. Tessa rose, smoothing her apron with unsteady hands. They offered me $15,000 to keep quiet, she said to the room, then to me. I donated it to the elementary school's lunch fund. I won't take money to forget who taught me to press apples. Her voice didn't break. It hardened. Vivian reached for the oldest weapon in her cabinet, the tone that turned accusation into etiquette. We acted to protect the brand, she said. A bad batch could sink a season. A business is not a shrine. You didn't protect a product, I said. You smothered the last living memory of the woman whose name you still sell on labels. The ring on my finger cut a small half-moon into my palm. Gideon shoved his chair back hard enough to screech. You don't belong here, Arlo. You never have. You'll always be the brother who couldn't keep up. I pulled the journal from the envelope, edges singed where the fire had kissed it the night before. She wrote otherwise, I said, laying it open. The pen lines were neat and certain. I read aloud and the room stopped breathing. This place will belong to Arlo. He understands the land and hears what it asks. I moved the book down the table, one council member to the next, hands, hesitating eyes narrowing and then softening as they found Florence's signature. The clock hit another second. Outside, a crow shrieked and flew. I am done begging for love from people who spell family with money, I said. And the truth of it came out steady. But I'm not done protecting what was placed in my hands. The words hung, and the clock gave them room. Even the heat registers seemed to wait. Gideon slammed the door on his way out the frame, rattling like a ribcage. Vivian kept her eyes on me, still and bright as glass, as if learning a new animal she didn't yet know how to kill. Harlan watched her, then me, his mouth pressed, thin pride and worry braided together. Malcolm stared at his shoes. No one spoke. In the silence I could hear what would come next, the sound of something sharpening in another room. They would not stop at a table and a vote. They would move the fight to where proof could be scorched black and blown to ash. I gathered the journal, the bottle, the drive, the letter. When I looked up, a councilman cleared his throat. We'll reconvene at noon with council, he said, which was another way of saying the dam had already cracked. As the room emptied, Harlan leaned close. You did it right, he said. Right is slower than wrong, but it lasts. His cough snagged on the last word. I steadied him until it passed. On my way out, I met my reflection in the glass of the framed harvest photo from the year I turned 10. Florence stood in the center, flower on her apron, sun making a crown of her white hair. I lifted my hand and touched the glass. The ring flashed. When I dropped my hand, I knew what the afternoon would bring, and I knew they would try to beat it there in the dark. Night came down clean and cold. In Florence's cottage, the old stove ticked as it cooled, and the moon laid a silver page across the stone bench where she used to peel apples. The quiet wasn't peace. It was the held breath before a blow. I sat with the journal in my lap, the burned edges flaking if I wasn't careful, then rose when I heard what the night had been holding back, the hiss and crackle of a flame that didn't belong. I ran the path by memory. At the edge of the private garden, orange licked the dark. Gideon stood with two men I didn't know, breaking apart old crates and feeding a low, hungry fire. The smoke reeked of varnish and paper. I didn't think. I moved. I kicked the crates aside, grabbed a burlap sack from the shed and crushed the flames under it while the men swore and stumbled back. Hot air slapped my face. Ash lifted and scattered like a flock. By the time I yanked the sack away, the fire was out, but not before it had chewed a corner off a box of notebooks. Pages curled inward, words eaten into lace. I lifted one and felt it disintegrate between my fingers. Those were hers. I said not to anyone who would answer, but to the night itself, and then I turned on my brother. What did you think you'd win by burning what you couldn't own? He opened his mouth, but Vivian's voice cut across the yard, carrying a crowd behind it. She'd brought witnesses, 2 guests from the wedding party who owed her favors and liked being near money. There, she said, pointing calm as a judge. You see, he's the one who set the fire. He's been unstable since the engagement party, angry, unpredictable. I've warned people. One of the guests nodded dutifully. The other filmed. The story assembled itself in the air, the resentful brother, the late-night rage, the attempt to torch the past as leverage for control. It would play well to anyone who wanted easy answers. Stop, I said. We both know what this is. My voice shook, not with fear, with fury I had finally decided to use. You ruined the wine, and now you're finishing the job. Gideon shifted like a man on a stage that had started to tilt. He looked toward the trees, as if an exit would open there. A cough tore through the gathering and the crowd parted. Harlan pushed forward with Tessa at his elbow, stubbornness propping his spine. You can let those lies fall where they may, he said, fighting for breath. I made copies years ago. The words landed like a door sliding a bolt. Her journals. A full set in a safe at the bank. Vivian's face drained. The men with Gideon looked suddenly like men who had wandered into the wrong fight. Harlan's knees softened, his hand pressed to his chest, and I was there a heartbeat later, steadying him onto the stone bench. The moon poured itself over his suit. For a second he looked exactly as he had when I was a boy, and he showed me how to tell with 2 fingers on a barrel whether the yeast was happy. Then the second passed, and the cough returned, and I hated them for making him spend his strength on this. Malcolm stepped from behind the cluster of guests as if he'd been called by a name. No one spoke. You're dragging us through the mud, Arlo, he said, voice too loud, like he had rehearsed it and wanted credit for delivering the line. This is a family matter. You don't air it like laundry. Your silence is the stain, I said, meeting his eyes. You stood next to a forged signature and called it weather. You watched them ruin her work and called it procedure. Every time you swallowed the truth, you fed the lie. He looked down, hands knotted. For once, he didn't have a way to iron the moment smooth. The guests shifted, the 2 hired men glanced at each other, and in the space between breaths, I understood the terrain. They would keep setting fires, literal or otherwise, until there was nothing left to burn. They would use his age, his cough, my anger, anything they could reach. They would gamble that noise beats proof. I lifted the journal, the pages blackened at the corner where the fire had nipped it, and found the place where Florence had taped in a recipe card she'd written in pencil and covered later with clear film. The pencil was faint, but I could still hear her voice in it. We're done playing where you can rewrite the script, I said to the yard. Tomorrow this goes to people who won't look away. The council, the sheriff, the press if I have to. Bring your witnesses and your stories, but bring them into daylight. Vivian's mouth curled. Half her face was silvered by the moon, half drowned in shadow. It struck me how perfectly that light fit her, never whole, always edited. You think the town will side with you, she said softly. They side with power. They side with harvest. Tessa answered before I could. And with the hands that make it. A murmur, small but real, pushed through the watchers. Not everyone wanted a performance. Some people wanted an orchard to survive. I looked at the scorched pages, at the letters that refused to vanish even when fire ate at their edges, and closed the book with care. I slid the ring around my finger until it clicked into the groove it had made. The cottage window threw a faint rectangle of light across the grass. Somewhere a night bird called then again, like a question. I answered it the only way I knew how. Tomorrow, I said, mostly to myself and to the woman whose name I carried in silver. Everything goes on the table. We stood there a minute longer, the two camps drawn in chalk by moonlight. Then the men with Gideon shuffled off into the rows. The wedding guests who had come to serve as chorus wandered back the way they'd come, their phones cold in their hands. Vivian lingered. She studied me with that half-lit gaze, as if committing my features to memory for a later war. When she finally turned, the air warmed a degree. I walked Harlan back to the cottage while Tessa carried the crate of saved notebooks that hadn't burned. At the door, he caught my sleeve. "Make it clean," he said, tired and fierce at once. "Don't let them turn you into what they need you to be." I promised him. He closed his eyes and sat, the cough easing as if the walls themselves hushed it. Outside, I stood where the yard met the first row of trees. The orchard was as close to silent as a living thing can be, roots drinking leaves, trading secrets with the air. I let the quiet climb into me until the shaking in my hands stopped. Then I looked down at the singed journal one more time, and at the mark the ring had pressed into my skin, a thin, bright crescent. The moon climbed higher. Half of Vivian's face was already gone into the dark. In a few hours, the clock in the wooden room would start counting again, and this time I would bring the morning with me. The main hall of the farmhouse had been used for festivals, for music, for laughter. On this morning, it held the kind of silence that trembles at the edge of thunder. Autumn sunlight streamed through tall windows and cut the room into halves. One beam landed on the long oak table, polishing it with gold, while the corner where Vivian and Gideon sat remained in shadow, their faces pale against the dark. The pendulum clock marked each second like a judge's gavel. Wooden chairs scraped as farmers' workers and a handful of city officials from Yakima shifted into place. Whispers rippled through the room, a rustling orchard of doubt and expectation. In front of me, I laid out the evidence one last time: the poisoned bottle of Florence's gold, the USB drive holding the footage, the scorched but legible journal, the letter Florence had left me, and the silver ring pressed tight against my finger. Beside me sat Tessa, upright and unwavering, and Harlan, pale but present, his cough muffled in his handkerchief. A local attorney leaned forward, notes ready, but I had promised myself my own voice would matter most. Vivian began with her smile that never reached her eyes. "Neighbors," she said, "we are gathered here because my late mother's will has been misinterpreted by a bitter relative. Arlo has spun tales out of jealousy, eager to ruin his brother's wedding joy." Gideon echoed her with a sneer. "He never could stand me being chosen. He wants what he doesn't deserve." Their words floated rehearsed and hollow. Behind them, Malcolm sat with his gaze lowered, lips pressed thin, as if waiting for the room to choose his part for him. I rose and set the USB into the projector. The screen flared. There was Gideon climbing the ladder to the vat, pouring the cloudy liquid, and Vivian's hand signing a document titled Cleaning Protocol. The image spoke in plain language no one could distort. Gasps cracked the silence. A worker in the back muttered, "God help us." Clara, who had bottled cider since her teens, covered her mouth and began to cry. I unscrewed the cork from the Florence's gold bottle. The acrid sting of chemicals filled the air. I held it high. This was meant to be my grandmother's gift, her pride. It has been poisoned, and with it her memory. A man who had pressed apples with her for 30 years stepped forward. He inhaled once and said firmly, "That smell doesn't belong to cider." The truth rolled across the room like an orchard wind. I opened the journal edges, still singed, and read aloud the words that had survived. "This land will belong to Arlo. He listens to it. He remembers." A silence fell so deep the wind outside could be heard in the window frame. Vivian leaned forward, about to interject, but Harlan's voice, slow and ragged, interrupted. "Florence wrote that when her mind was clearest. She meant every word." The pressure broke Malcolm at last. He lurched to his feet, hands trembling. "They told me to keep quiet," he said, his voice unsteady but carrying. "I signed papers because I feared losing everything. But Arlo speaks the truth." Vivian whipped toward him, shrieking, "Sit down, don't you dare." But he bowed his head. His confession cut a path no denial could cover. I stood straighter, ring glinting in the beam of light. All eyes fixed on me, some for the first time, not with suspicion but with expectation. "You called me a failure," I said evenly. "But it was not I who failed this family. It was you who turned kinship into currency, memory into market." The hall echoed with the weight of the words. No one tried to speak over them. The attorney rose, document in hand. By the original testament and supporting evidence, he declared the rightful stewardship of the farm lies with Arlo Kane. Murmurs surged, a wave breaking. Vivian and Gideon blanched, caught between disbelief and fury, their power evaporating in the daylight. The crowd shifted toward me, and for the first time in years I felt not an outcast, but a figure standing in the sun. The council dismissed the gathering with formality, but I did not hear the closing words. I stood in the shaft of autumn light, its warmth on my face, and understood winning this was only the beginning. The greater task would be to breathe life back into what had been strangled, to rebuild the orchard, not just in soil, but in spirit. The fight for truth had ended,